Hi, Shelley. How you doing today?
I'm doing well, Juan. Thank you very much.
Okay, great. So let's go to the next slide, please, Shelley. So, everybody, a little bit of webinar housekeeping. Please keep your microphones muted. And since there is quite a bit of number of people on this webinar today, we do have a chat feature. You do have a chat feature where you can submit questions. And hopefully at the end, we should be able to answer as many as possible. If not, I am going to make sure that I do save all the questions that are being sent through the chat feature, and we will be answering them as best as possible. After the presentation, I will be sending the slides along with other handouts and great information that is provided by the master gardeners. Okay, let's see. So once again, we are going to be having a Q&A at the very end. And once again, thank you for joining us. So before we get started, let me introduce our instructor for today, Shelley Trainer. Shelley Trainer. Shelley is a master gardener who loves creating and giving presentations, particularly about edible gardens and succulents, as this is what comprises much of her current garden. She is also a docent at Sherman Library and Gardens, where she gives tours and helps visitors learn about the special place in Corona del Mar. Prior to retiring, Shelley had a number of careers, including high school math teaching, media marketing, computer consulting, and mechanical engineering. Shelley's own small space garden is her lab to experiment while attempting to maintain curb appeal for her home, since her front yard is her primary planting space. Well, we're very happy to have Shelley. She's an excellent instructor, and please enjoy the webinar. Take it away, Shelley.
Thanks, Juan. I appreciate it. Um, Obviously, if there's any issues, you have the information on how to contact Juan. I'm obviously sitting remotely. This is very odd. This is the first time I've given a presentation like this. I think I've decided it's like must be like being a radio host when you have absolutely no feedback from your audience. So anyway, here we go. We're got a lot of people have become very interested in edible gardening. Some of you may be pros at it, and some of you may have just started in the last few months, which seems to be a common element among people. You really can do a whole lot of different things with your garden, and no matter how big or how small. So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about today. The most important thing is where your garden is growing. And I know this is a real estate little slogan, location, location, location. It makes a huge difference. And so we're going to talk about some factors in choosing your location and what some of the implications are if you don't choose the proper location. This happens to be the front of my yard a couple summers ago. It is definitely the front of my house, and I do have edibles growing. So what is it you need to know about plants and growing edibles? This is plants in general, but the reason this is important is edibles have a little bit different requirements. So solar powered, they need sun, and full sun is best. Why is this? I mean, people tell me, oh, I've been able to grow in my garden inside my house. I can grow in shade. Yeah, you can. There's a lot of places you can grow. Plants are very adaptable. Their whole mode of operation is to figure out how to best survive and reproduce. That's their whole goal. Photosynthesis, if you don't think about it, if you don't remember learning about it, this is why the sun is so important, because the plants, unlike us humans and the rest of the mammal and a lot of the rest of the world of living things, we put food in our mouth. Plants don't have mouths, obviously. They use photosynthesis as the energy, the driver to create food within their own body of their plants. They do need to have to intake air They need to intake nutrients and water through their roots, but they need, without the sun, they can't grow. And so for edibles, if you think about an edible is something that is trying to grow really fast in a growing season to produce something that we end up harvesting to eat, very unlike our ornamentals. So they need a lot of sun to produce the kinds of devices, and I'm going to call in the summer something related to seeds, that takes a lot of energy to produce. A tomato, a squash, a melon, a pepper, whatever it is you're growing, that plant needs a lot of energy. So it needs a lot of leaves and it needs a lot of sun. Yes, you can grow it in part shade. You just may not get as many of the things you're trying to grow for, be it a tomato or a piece of fruit. So full sun is best. Think about when you've ever been to a farm. There's nothing blocking the sun. So if you live like I do in a community where it's suburban or urban, you've got things that create shade, be it another plant, a tree, a fence, a wall, a building. So you need to think about where that shade is and try to minimize the shade for your edibles. And it does make a difference around here. We can grow crops year round in Orange County, which is fabulous. But remember, these are crops that are not native to Southern California. So the sun is already here, but we'll talk about the summer and winter crops a little bit later in general, but there are some different needs in terms of the intensity of the sun. But what we need to add and what has been added and why Orange County is orange, what's called Orange County because of the oranges, is the other thing the plants need is water. So you can have all the sun in the world, like in our deserts, but if there's no water. So that's what happened in California, that we've figured out how to get water where we need it. So you need to pick a location that not only provides you with sufficient sun, but a place that you can provide water to. So if you've got a large area that you're going to be planting edibles in or have planted or in raised beds that are large, your irrigation needs to be something that is deep and slow. You're talking about a large amount of area that you're going to want to wet, but you don't really need to wet the areas in between the plants, which is why drip irrigation can be very effective for edibles. You don't want to water all the time. You really want to get it to the root structure. And then you want to prevent the soil from drying out, which is what mulch, the picture on the right with that happens to be a straw mulch. What mulch can help you do is keep the moisture in the soil so that the sun and the wind don't dry it out. Now, for a lot of you, you're probably doing what I do, which is grow in a lot of containers. Containers dry out quickly. No matter the smaller the container, the faster it dries out. Different types of containers dry out faster. You will need to water more frequently. You can hand water, but you've got to be consistent, meaning you want it to dry out a little bit, but you don't want it to get too dry. And so that's why a lot of people will try to do some kind of a drip irrigation or something that puts it on a timer. You don't really want to water the leaves. You want the water in the soil. There's a lot of reasons for not wanting to water the leaves, but just so be it that you're not looking for overhead watering. So even when you're hand watering, try to get the moisture on the soil and not on the plants. And that I mentioned, I didn't talk about the mulch. Mulching is good, but it's more difficult in containers. And again, we'll chat about that a little bit more. So sun and water, critical components to growing edibles. But things you also need to be considering when you're looking at a location is access. Maybe you want to have it on your rooftop. How often do you go up there? Is it in the back of your property? If you can't get to it, you're not going to be able to go and tend to it as often. You're not going to notice if it's dry. You want to consider where it's hot and cold. Because if you have a high section or a low section of your yard, heat rises, cold, and the cold falls. So you might get it may be too cold or too hot. And also in our area, with the temperatures we've had the last couple days, it can get almost too hot for some of the plants. Think about where you might have pests. If you live next to open space, you are going to be very hard pressed to get rid of rodents and other creatures that come into your yard unless you provide some kind of fencing around your garden. If you grow like in the middle picture, along with ornamentals and grass, that's great, but those grasses and ornamentals might have pests like snails that and others that will come. So consider your location for that. Things to consider, not necessarily about your location, but cost. It does cost a lot to grow your own edibles. Not necessarily more, but it depends. So there is a cost, not just buying the plants, but taking care of them. And then timing. Again, we're running into the time when it's not a great time to be doing a lot of new planting because it's going to be too hot and the sun is too intense. June is probably still okay. It's really hard to plant in July and August and be successful. Plus, it's nearing the end of the season. So you've got the things you've thought about in terms of location, sun, water, some of the other concerns. Then you got to think about the thing that is also critical, which is what you're growing in. The ground, if you're a large area or a raised bed, very different than others. But if you've got a large area that you're growing in, and this, again, if this is starting from scratch, you're probably a little beyond this at this point, but you could still get started. You want that soil to have both you want it to have some nutrients in it, which compost helps with some of the amendments. Then the soil, but that soil can't be hard and tough. If you can't break it up with a shovel, those roots are going to have a hard time getting through it too. So you want to make the soil pliable enough that the plant can actually develop a good root structure. So, which is why you want to turn it up, mix in compost. Compost goes into your soil. It is not a top dressing. It is something that adds structure and fertility and nutrients to your soil. If you have a large area, that's a lot of what the earthworms that live in there are doing for you, is creating natural compost. You will want to appropriately fertilize. We'll talk a little more about fertilizing. Breaking smooth just makes it easier to plant and take care of. And mulch. So mulch goes on top of the soil. Mulch is generally larger pieces, ideally of organic materials. Rock is not a good idea for mulching around edibles. It retains the heat. You don't want to retain the heat. You want to keep that soil at a cooler temperature, which the mulch helps with preventing weeds, with keeping the soil temperature low, with keeping the evaporation reduced. So mulch is really good, but you don't want to mix the mulch into your soil. It needs to stay on top. If you're growing in small spaces, you want to use good quality potting soil. You've got a contained environment. You aren't likely to get worms in it. You're not likely to get any of the other microorganisms that tend to thrive in soils. So the potting soil, one of the biggest components of potting soil that's important is it's either perlite or other materials that provide airspace. Roots need airspace because they actually breathe. Roots help provide nutrients from air and breathing. So they need water at times, but they also need air. And so the materials that they put in good potting soils give you enough airspace for those roots. This is where it can get expensive. You really need to replace at least 1/3 of your potting soil each time you replace your plants for a new season. Your plants use it all up. and it gets compacted, and there's nothing in there like a worm to help break it up. So you really need to get rid of your old potting soil and start again. And sometimes if you've planted a lot in one thing, the roots will take up the whole thing, so you'll be replacing the entire amount of soil every year. And mulching. Mulching is good for everything. The problem in a pot is if you're going to be pulling out a plant and putting in something new, you don't want the mulch to get into your soil. So if it's small pieces, it's hard to get it out of the way when you're taking care of your plants. So mulch is still good, but if it's got to be something you can move. I've experimented with wine corks as mulch. They don't add any nutritional benefit, but they're easy to take out of the pot when I want to do things. But pots, again, you need regular water and fertilizer, which is, again, containers. So one of the most important things to successfully grow is you've got to have drainage in your containers. You need drain holes. And you don't want saucers under those drain holes for a couple of reasons. One, it keeps water there in contact with the bottom of the soil. And two, vector control will tell you that's perfect breeding for mosquitoes. And we are now in mosquito season. They only need like a thimbleful of water in order to breed. So it may be messy, but you really don't want saucers under any of your pots. That's a corner of my yard you see there. And I have supports to raise up all the pots so that there's airflow underneath them. Bigger is better. The bigger the pot, the more soil, the more moisture that it'll be able to retain for the longer time. They can be heavy. One of those in there on mine is actually on wheels, so I can move it around because it gets really heavy. It makes a difference as to what kind of material your pot's made up. If it's a glazed pot, if it's a metal pot, if it's a plastic pot, they don't breathe as much, so they will tend to retain moisture more and won't need as much water as the unglazed terracotta pots. Or if you grow in like a growing bag, there's lots of things you can grow in these days, but you're going to want to modify your irrigation based on how fast things dry out. Lots of little tips. I do put coffee filters in the drain hole. They disintegrate, which is perfect. All it does is keep a lot of little loose dirt when I'm initially planting from coming out. You don't want to block that hole. You want dirt all the way through the entire container. I don't care how big it is. Fill it all with soil. Do not put anything else in the bottom of the container other than soil. And consider drip irrigation. Again, in the picture, you may see I have 6 different controllers there for the 6 zones in my yard to be able to control the amount of water. And I do use drip irrigation. You can see lots of little tubes running around. So now you've figured out a location where you can put your plants. It's got sun, it's got water, you've got good soil, you're ready to grow. So what do you grow? You've got so many choices, which is really the reason to do this. But you need to know what grows when. And the thing that we're looking at right now is the warm season annuals and also warm season perennials, although it's a little late to plant a fruit tree at this point to get any kind of production right now. I call them seed containers because the things we're trying to grow to eat are the things that have the seeds for those plants. Think everything, the simple ones, tomatoes, peppers, cucumbers, squash, melons, strawberries, all of those things. Strawberries are a perennial, but we're growing them for their their seed container, and that is what makes an annual. They spend 1 year producing as many seed containers as they can, and then they die. So those are the kinds of things that we grow in our warm season, meaning longer days of sun, more intense sun, more heat. And so that's what we are planting right now or are growing right now. The cool season annuals, and again, we're blessed in Orange County. We're not talking, most of us, with areas that freeze. Cool season annuals do not grow where it freezes. They grow this time of year in places that are more northerly in the northern hemisphere that don't get as hot and don't get as high and the angle of the sun is different. And those are the things we grow to eat things like leaves, think spinach, lettuce, the buds, think broccoli, cauliflower, those are all immature flowers. Roots, think carrots or turnips or even potatoes. So those are the cool season. Those are the things we grow here, not this time of year. So maybe if you're for your fall planting, if you want to start planting in say September while the ground is still warm, those are the kinds of things that you would plant then. So you've got to figure out what the right timing is. Perennials Perennials typically are best planted in the non-growing season. So if you want to grow fruit trees here, the best time to plant them is generally in January. And they produce seasonally. So right now, my apple tree and my peach tree are loaded and just starting to get ripe, which is fabulous. Perennials such as herbs do grow year round here. And especially if you keep them cut back, you could probably have a lot of different herbs year round without having to replant them. Things like basil, you will have to replant, and it really likes summer much better than winter. So how do you pick? So for me, it's things I either like to eat or would want to try to eat. Maybe the things that you see at a farmer's market. If you're going to a nursery to pick out your fruits and vegetables, you will be limited to what they sell. If you use seeds, you'll have a lot more different options. With tomatoes, there's a lot of heirlooms and other fun things, but they're not disease resistant. And the kind of diseases that they get won't hurt you, and they won't hurt your fruit or make it inedible. What they do is they reduce the vitality of your actual plants themselves, and they may not produce as much. So that's why you look for some of that. But if you're especially like me, you're growing in the front of the house, grow things that are pretty. The foliage is pretty, the vegetables are pretty. And again, some things like more heat. For instance, peppers, whether they be hot peppers or sweet peppers, they need a lot more heat than your tomatoes need. So you want to, if you've got a really hot spot, some of the other things take more heat too. So you want to match, look at your containers and see what it says, but you want to match your growing characteristics to your site. So what do you start with? I alluded to seeds and then transplants. Seeds give you lots more variety. I've decided this year I wanted to try some things like Persian cucumbers and the little bitty cute sweet peppers that I see in the stores, things that I think would be fun. Those plants are not available at my local nurseries. So I have to grow them by seed. Growing from seed is a lot slower. You've got to allow the germination time. Some things take as long as a couple weeks to germinate. Germinate means go from put a seed in the ground to seeing actual leaves start to pop out of the ground. The seeds also, if you grow them outside, every pest in the world seems to love the new growth on seeds. I have gone out to my garden having planted seeds. I've seen the new leaves pop up one day. I go out the next day and there's nothing there. It's just been mowed down. So I have to put netting over. So you have to be more careful with your baby plants when they're growing from seed. I tend to try to grow them inside to start them just because I can for some of them. So the easiest thing to do is to grow transplants, and that's essentially what you're doing when you're starting by seed. If you're not starting them in the ground where you're going to grow them, if you start them in a pot, you're creating your own transplants. They're beyond some of the issues with seeds. You won't have as many pests attacking them as quickly, although snails love all new transplants too. But but you are more limited as to what the varieties that are available, but they're certainly a lot easier. So now you've figured out what you're growing. You're either doing seeds or you've got plants that you've bought. They will need nutrients. And again, if they're in a container, they need a lot more nutrients. There are 3 primary nutrients that are in all fertilizers that you can buy. That's nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium. Look on the container and you will somewhere see those three numbers, usually separated with a little dot as shown in the slide there. The first one is always nitrogen, the second one is always phosphorus, and the third is always potassium. Happens to be in alphabetical order for the words, not for the atomic symbols for those elements, as cake does not come after P in our alphabet. But anyway, nitrogen is what our plants need to get nice, good, strong stalks and green leaves. The more nitrogen, the more the leaves. So especially in the beginning, if you're going to try changing your fertilizers up, you really want to help your plants with nitrogen because they're starting to get growing. The phosphorus is what they need for flowers and fruiting. So some people actually change the fertilizer that they're using depending on what the stage of your plant is. As their plant's actually starting to flower, they'll give it a higher phosphorus fertilizer. The potassium is actually kind of a facilitator, and we don't need high potassium typically in our area. Combination of the fact that if you're growing in our soils, they're very alkaline, and our water is very alkaline as a result. So alkalines are salts, potassium is a salt. So that kind of nutrient is actually already native in our area. So you don't typically have to worry about the potassium number. And if it's at 0, it's okay for your plants. A lot of the fertilizers you buy will also have other essential elements, which, like vitamins for us, they do help with plant growth and they can be helpful. The one thing that you really need to know is follow the label instructions. I can't emphasize that more strongly. If it says use a tablespoon in a gallon of water every 2 to 3 weeks, every week is not going to be better. More nutrients does not mean better. Sometimes you'll get a lot more green growth, but that also may cause you other problems that we'll talk about in a second. And what are some of your options? So those numbers, when you have really large numbers like a 20-20-20, that's a synthetic fertilizer. The only thing with synthetic is it's the natural elements. It is nitrogen, phosphorus, and potassium, but it's made in a lab and not made from a naturally growing plant or other material like an algae or something. So they're fast. They're inexpensive. You don't need to use them as often. The time release ones are typically synthetics. If you use a lot of it, you can, because they're a little bit higher in the salt content, you can accumulate more salts in your ground, which is bad, particularly in a pot. There's some pollution concerns because there's more chance of runoff. Natural ones are the lower numbers. You might see numbers as low as like 111. You often have to do it more often. Some of them have odors. Some of them that are made with algae and things actually have an odor you might not like, but other animals may like. So both of them work equally as well as long as you follow the instructions. This is what happens to everybody, pests. And so you've got to figure out how to manage your pests. And the term IPM, or integrated pest management, is doing that in a way that is least harmful, least toxic first, and trying to rely as much on nature as you can. My favorite pest management are the creatures that come in my yard. I have birds hanging out in my tomatoes. They're trying to eat the little tomato worms that show up. So do the wasps. You may not like wasps. I'm not fond of them from the stinging standpoint. I don't want nests at my house, but they do eat caterpillars. And I've watched them eat them on my plants. Ladybug ladybug beetles, like you see there, eat aphids and aphid eggs. So those, if you can encourage those natural predators, you're doing great. So you want to be least harmful first, and cultural is what we're kind of talking about. The other part of cultural is not having too much growth too fast. So if you fertilize too much, you have a lot more green growth, and it's kind of like a neon sign to the bugs in your area. Oh, look, brand new growth. I'm going there. So too much fertilizer can also result in more pests. Mechanical is what I result to, and we'll talk about that a little bit more in the next slide. Organic, some of the pests, there are some things out there like iron phosphate for snails. It's organic. It is not harmful for people. It is not harmful to pets. But it is a organic chemical. And then the other chemicals, I don't put chemicals on my edibles because those are things I'm going to eat. I simply don't. If it's not something I would eat or I would be afraid of ingesting, I don't use it for my edibles. If you feel you need a chemical, always read the directions. I understand that they're in the smallest print possible. You may need a magnifying glass and follow every bit of the directions. It should be your last resort if there's a problem. And maybe sometimes the resort is, I can't grow this here. And do remember that it's okay to have holes in your plants. I've got holes in my plants as long as I'm getting the production I want in terms of the edibles. If I have to take off a few leaves or they're not as pretty as they might be, it's okay. So what are some of the least toxic things? The first one is what I do all the time. Pick them off, squash them, squirt. A lot of things can be resolved by squirting a hard spray of just plain old water. All you do is spray hard and it dislodges them. It takes them a while to come back. Maybe they won't come back, but they won't be there. Trapping, even things like that sticky trap, that is a little yellow card. You can buy them, they're sticky. That color, sometimes they're green, attracts a lot of different things, particularly like white flies. You can buy things that are called pheromones and other attractants that are specific. You've got to know what it is you're trying to get rid of if you're going to use something like a pheromone or a growth regulator or even a repellent. Something that repels snails isn't going to do anything for aphids or whiteflies, and vice versa. You can use dusts, you can use oils and sprays. Again, the criteria I use for edibles is something that I will not be afraid to put in my own body if I got it in me. And so there's some things, botanical pesticides like BT, which is Bacillus thuringiensis, very available commonly for lots of different vendors in all the nurseries. It will kill small caterpillars. Doesn't do anything to flying insects, doesn't do anything to anything that's bigger than maybe an inch. So if you're talking about tomato worms, you got to get them little. But so there are a lot of things you can do, but you will have pests. So good things to do. If you spray your plant with water, I told you before, don't really want your leaves wet, but if you're trying to find your tomato worm, there's a picture of a nice big juicy one up in the upper right corner. If you spray a light spray with water, they start to wiggle. So you might be able to see them better. They've been known not to be as fond of cherry tomato plants. One of your easiest thing to grow is cherry tomatoes. So if you want success early on in your growing career, grow cherry tomatoes. They don't need nearly as much sun. They grow prolifically and they don't attract as many pests. Soil-borne pests. Again, these are things you don't see. They just reduce the vitality of your plants. This is one of the reasons for replacing your soil every year, or in the case of being growing in the ground, why people don't grow tomatoes in the same place or any other plants in the same family year after year, because there are soil-borne diseases that damage your plants and make it so you can't grow as well. So people rotate. If you are trying to eliminate different pests, particularly flying things, one, it's going to be difficult, but we need those a lot of them are pollinators, including wasps and butterflies, which may be laying eggs and moths that will end up being caterpillars. Without those pollinators, you're not going to get a harvest in a lot of your different things, particularly things like squash. Zucchini is notorious because it has male and female flowers on the same plant. If the pollen from the male flower doesn't get to the female flower, then you don't get any squash. So if you eliminate a lot of the different insects, you're not going to get as much growing. If you've got to spray anything at all, spray other than water, spray in the evening. Why do I say that? Bugs, the flying insects, are less active in the evening, and so you're not going to have any unintended mortality of things that you didn't want to kill, like our bees. So your gardening is great fun, but you're really never done. I mean, I go out and check pretty much daily my plants. You are going to have to manage the size, meaning sometimes you want to trim things to encourage growth. If you're growing fruits like apples and peaches, you do need to take off thin some of them so that the plant can put enough energy into making big ones rather than lots of little ones. You have to stake things and support. Sometimes if you're growing heavy fruits, like a melon of some sort, you're going to want to support it, keep it off of the ground, because it will rot if sitting on the ground. You've got to monitor. Just like our own health, if you don't see it until it's really bad, then it's a lot harder to take care of. So your plants will talk to you. If they're looking wilted and you know you're not overwatering, there are water meters you can stick in to tell your finger. They will look wilted. They may need water. Like the other day Monday, when we had really high winds, I had to go out and put extra water on all my plants. The wind causes them all to start to shrivel up because it takes all the moisture out of them. So, and the other thing about monitoring, you're talking about fruits and vegetables, they go from ready to past ready, past prime, really quickly. That really lovely strawberry may be mushy if you don't pick it when it's ready. So if you don't look regularly, you may miss some of your production. Little things you might think about. Definitely younger, smaller is more tender, really applies to things like squash. You take off something, that plant, remember, these are their reproductive structures you're taking off. If you take something off, it's going to put more energy into the new ones because it's still trying to make seeds. And if you're growing things like lettuces in other times of the year, if you just pull off the outer ones, the inner ones will still, core will still keep growing. So things you can do. You definitely want to garden smarter. And this sounds kind of corny, but it really does help to keep a calendar or a diary or some kind of written record. I don't care if that's electronic or on paper, but know what you've planted, when you've planted, the time of year, what was successful. That will really help you know what works well. And like we talked about before, if I want to try to grow lettuce now, it's going to be too hot and it's going to go to seed too fast and I'm not going to get much. So, plant the things that are in the right season and be ready. So knowing that fall will be coming in September, I'll be taking out stuff, even tomatoes that are probably still producing, just so I have room for the things for the next crop. What you'll use. I mean, it may be really exciting to plant 15 tomato plants, unless you're into canning or you want to give it away to neighbors and friends. it doesn't make sense to put in all that effort to grow something you can't, if quantities are too big. And do label them, because you do tend to forget what you've planted. Successive planting means things like you put in by seed, or anything like carrots. If you put in a whole row of carrots and you get 50 carrots or even 10 carrots all at once, and then they're gone, then what? So plant 5 or 6 or 10 1 week, and then 2 or 3 weeks later plant some more, and that way you'll have things that you can harvest. And definitely your beneficial partners are the insects and the natural um, world that's out there. So here's some tips to add to this. The most important is it is okay to fail. I've heard horticulturists often quote that if you're not killing plants, you're not gardening. It will happen. And this is how you'll know, did I put it in the right location or not? You'll know if you don't get many tomatoes or peppers or any, or it gets eaten by bugs, or it wilts because it got too hot. You'll know you had the wrong location. You might not know right away, but you will know. Except less than perfect. Not everything you grow is going to look like that gorgeous apple that you get in the stores. But you know what? There's nothing wrong with it. And I'll admit that if I've got a little hole in something, that because something else cut to it before I did, I'll just cut that area away. It's typically nothing that's wrong with the rest of the fruit that I've just harvested. Spend time. The more you get to know and you see what's growing and what grows well, the better off you're going to be. And use this as a chance to try something new. You may find that you've never grown cucumbers, or you've never grown potatoes. They're really fun to grow. Give it a try. If you don't succeed, then you know, but it's really fun to harvest this stuff. Believe the labels. If it says it's going to get 6 feet tall, chances are it will. And keeping it to 2 feet tall isn't going to work very well. It may not get much production, and it may be difficult to manage. So, and if it says it needs 3 feet of space, it's not going to grow in something that gives you only 1 foot. And probably the most important of all, more is not better. More water is not better, because if those roots are waterlogged, they can't breathe. If they can't breathe, it's going to look like your plant is not getting enough water and it'll die, but it's really because the roots are waterlogged. Too much fertilizer, I talked about that. Not only does it encourage pests, for too much new growth, that the plant can't necessarily sustain all that growth, and so it will weaken the plant because the roots aren't going to grow as fast. And also it can absorb, if too much fertilizer can actually block the absorption spots on the roots, and then they can't absorb it. So, and also more plants is not better. If they're too crowded, you might not be able to get the production you want. Pests cannot be eliminated. I don't care what you do. We're never going to eliminate all the pests out there. So figure out the way to best deal with them and live with it. But on the good side, share your success. I just saw on social media today somebody sharing that pictures of their kale and artichokes that they had grown, that they were ready to eat. Enjoy it. Share it. You can give away what you got, but brag a bit, because if you've gotten something that you can eat, that's great, and you should be really, really proud of yourself for having done that. So you may have questions. This will be in the handouts again. There are ways to get help. I am an Orange County Master Gardener, and we're affiliated through the University of California. We have a hotline. The email is the best. There's no such thing as calling and getting a live person on a phone. Send pictures. Give as much description as you can when you send an email, and they will get back to you with as much information as they can. Those are volunteers that are like me that answer that, and they have access to a lot of experts in the fields. But those experts have created some sites that you can go to. If you don't want to wait for an answer, the IPM website that's listed there It has so much information, even by types of different edibles, what kinds of damage, and you can figure out what it is and get suggestions on how to deal with it. And then this presentation's put on by IRWD, their website, and their Rightscape site will give you even more information. So that's a really brief, quick 45, 50 minutes or so of growing edibles. And now it's time for me to try to answer questions as much as I can. So thank all of you for listening.
Okay, everybody, please keep your phones muted. We're going to be answering some questions that were submitted via the chat menu. Shelly, I guess I'll just read them off.
Yeah.
Once, and then we'll try to answer as many. But I have been copying them, so in the email that's going to be sent after this presentation, it should be sent as soon as possible. But we're going to include a handout with the slides that Shelly presented, and we have tons of handouts regarding seeds, where to go, just a lot of great information that Master Gardener was able to provide. And let's see what else. Let me finish. And let's see what that said. Let's go to some of the questions. So I'm going to start at some of the beginning. And if you do have more questions, please just keep submitting them via the chat feature. And I'm sure we'll be able to get to them either in a bit or by email. Please keep your phones or your computer muted. We can go through these. So let's see, Shelly. So one of the questions I have is,
Well, cardboard is actually a form of mulching. Anything that you put on top of your soil that isn't in your soil um, is would be considered a mulch. The What it is you can use pretty much anything. Cardboard can be used. You want to make sure it's clean cardboard because you never know what was on that. I mean, certainly not one that's had oils and other things because that cardboard will um, decompose over time as it gets wet, and that's okay. But the the
Shelly?
Still there?
Shelly?
Yeah.
There you are. So I think you dropped out. You were talking about, yes.
Anyway, you can use anything for mulch. It's just you want to make sure, like if you use, some people use straw, you want to make sure it doesn't have seeds in it. And so that's another thing that you've got to be concerned with. But there's really nothing that will hurt it. But the problem with cardboard is it's not porous at all. So it until it's soaked through, the areas under there aren't going to get moist. And so most mulches are porous, and that they're probably a better choice than cardboard.
Okay, another question is, can you use 100% compost in containers?
Compost does not have any form of vermiculite or anything else, because actually soil has got a lot of different components. Compost is just an organic material, which is really important, but you need the what's called the clay and the sand, and the loam that's creating the ability to retain. You want to retain just enough moisture, but you also want to let moisture pass through. And compost should only be used as a soil amendment in quantities. There's no set amount, depends on the size. I put, a cup full maybe even every several inches in a pot, but definitely use a good potting soil compost will indeed compress too quickly, and you won't have good long-term results.
Okay. Another question is, what potting materials dries out faster?
What potting?
Potting. It says what pot material dries out soil faster?
Well, having experimented with all kinds of things, the thing that dries out the absolute fastest is what they call planting bags. You can buy bags. I've actually used other, they breathe, they transpire, and they dry out really fast. Next after that is unglazed terracotta pots. Um, and so those are the two that dry out the fastest because they are porous. Anytime then that you've coated the outside of a pot of any kind or made it with a non-porous material, a metal, I mean, even wood is a little porous, but once it gets soaked, it doesn't dry out as quickly. So definitely potting bags and terracotta dry out the quickest.
Okay, I saw another question related to potting soil. Are there any pests in commercial potting soil?
Are there any pests?
Pests. Can commercial potting soil come with pests in it?
Hopefully not. I will tell you that I bought some worm compost that has seeds in it, and I've gotten weeds sprouting in my plants. So that's probably the biggest risk you've got is seeds in both any kind of, especially compost, depending on how that compost was made. I've never had any seeds or any pests or anything in any commercially bought potting soils. I would be surprised to find that. It is treated with usually heat treated, and most pests can't survive that.
Okay, another question is, why is my squash plant only producing male flowers?
Well, it's probably producing both male and female flowers, but because you don't have any pollinators, the female flowers disappear really quickly. That is one of the most common problems. You need pollinators. What do you do to get pollinators? Grow something that's flowering, things that bees and wasps like. There's a whole variety of flowers out there you can grow. One of the things I grow is an herb called borage, Borage, that flowers, even your flowering time and your flower, if you let your plants flower and attract bees and butterflies and other things, then you're more likely. There is a way, not everyone is successful. You can actually take a paintbrush and take the pollen off of the male flowers and put it on the female flowers when you see them by hand. I have not heard of anybody. A friend of mine tried it unsuccessfully. I've not done that. I find planting flowers to be the best thing to do.
Okay. Suggested non-edible plants to be sacrificial for IPM before planting? Question mark.
Sacrificial plants. A lot of people do try to have sacrificial plants. A sacrificial plant is one that you've planted knowing that something will eat it before they get to your desired plants. It depends on what the pest is, because if it's, say, rabbits, they like a lot of greens. And so, deer like certain things. It would be anything that's far away from your plant. There's no one sacrificial plant that will work. But as I said, yeah, there's a whole lot of both ornamentals and edibles that you can plant depending on which pest you're trying to attract.
Okay. What's your opinion on neem oil?
On what?
On neem oil.
Oh, neem oil. I it is listed as something that is acceptable to use. If you read about it, there are some issues that organic gardeners have with putting it on their plants. I personally don't use it, but I know a lot of people that do and do very successfully. So my personal opinion is I have not I don't go out of my way to use it, and I don't own any. Do the research online and see what people have said, pros and cons, and make your own choice based on it, on how you feel about it. It does successfully help with certain kinds of pests, but again, it has to be specific to the kind of pest that it does help with.
Okay. Let's see. Is a tomato plant seasonal? Question mark. Do I have to plant every year?
If you want good production, a tomato plant is seasonal. I have friends that leave their tomatoes in all winter long, and they do get some production. What happens is the tomato plant will get leggy. I mean, it may end up being 12 feet long by the time that the next season rolls around, and you really don't get a lot of tomatoes. It's kind of fun to leave them for a while, but again, you're going to have to care for it and just get a few tomatoes. So in our environment, some tomatoes will actually grow year round. The things you need to do, the person I know that's most successful with growing tomatoes in the winter, it's by a brick wall, and that brick wall gets a lot of sun and retains a lot of heat. So even on cold days, it stays warm enough to keep those tomatoes happy. If they get too cool, they'll just they just will quit producing anything.
Okay, great. I think we have time for a couple of more.
Okay.
But everybody who's still on, just like I said, we will be answering all the questions again. I'm going to go through them myself, and hopefully with Shelly, so we can kind of get some good information for you guys. So please keep submitting questions via the chat menu so we can save them, and we'll make sure to get to you quickly. So let's see. Here's what is the best way to pollinate if we don't have any help from our animals?
Best way, there you'll have each and every one is a little different. There are some that you can try, and they do this commercially hand pollinating, and it usually involves a paintbrush that you use the paintbrush to get the pollen off of the male flower to put it on a female flower. But things like tomatoes are self-pollinating. They have both male and female structures within their flower. And so there's really nothing you can do to pollinate what they call perfect flowers. If it's not creating, say, a tomato, then there's other environmental conditions that are causing that not to happen, and there's nothing you can do unless you could change your environmental condition.
Yeah, you know what, Sean? That was part of a bigger question. I think the person that asked it was asking that because they have a chirimoya tree that appears to have lots of flowers, but they're not producing fruit. And if I recall, like you said, I remember going in there and using a paintbrush to pollinate chirimoya flowers to be able to produce fruit. It's a tropical fruit. It's a little bit more difficult to grow here, but I've seen it grown in our area, of course.
Oh yeah, there are chirimoyas that are grown, and again, then you have to be very specific for which kind of plant. And my best suggestion for you is, I don't grow chirimoyas, so I don't know a lot about them, but definitely either ask the hotline or just do some research online, and you'll hand pollinating chirimoyas, and I'm sure you will get a whole bunch of suggestions on how to do that.
Okay,
Videos.
Well, I think that's going to be our last question for today. It's 1:00. So first of all, I'd like to thank everybody who stuck around for the Q&A, which was fantastic. And Shelly, I can't thank you enough. The presentation was fantastic once again. Hopefully we can do this again for people that missed out. But either way, great job. And once again, thank you to everybody. Thank you to the OC Master Gardeners.
And thanks, Juan. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you, everybody. And once again, I will be emailing the presentation materials out. And thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon and great week. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Juan.
Thank you. Oh, that was great, Shelly.
Good. I'm I'm glad it worked out. It's just so weird just sitting here talking.